So today we have with us Dr. Ken Gergen, who's a founding member and president of the Taos Institute and chair of the board. He is currently a senior research professor of psychology at Swarthmore College. He's a major figure in the development of social constructionist theory and its applications to practices of social change. He also lectures widely on contemporary issues in cultural life, including the self, technology, postmodernism, the civil society, organizational change, developments in psychotherapy, educational practices, aging, and political conflict. Gergen has published over 300 articles in journals, magazines, and books. His major books include Towards Transformation in Social Knowledge, The Saturated Self, Realities and Relationships, An Invitation to Social Construction, and Relational Being. And for me, most importantly, he was actually the first thinker that exposed me to social construction and sent me on this trajectory of my career. So I'm just thrilled to be here today with you, Dr. Gergen. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. And I hope your career has been thrilling as well. I hope the steps were good ones.
Yes, you sent me on the right path or the wrong path. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's always in progress.
Exactly. So I, we were chatting before we started recording, and we've actually been trying to schedule this call for about 5 weeks, about a little over a month now, just because of scheduling conflicts, couldn't get it pinned down. And it was fascinating how every time that we emailed to reschedule, the conversation, the idea of the conversation would transform. Originally, it was kind of mid-quarantine, and I was thinking, oh, well, we will chat about the self in the quarantine. And then it was kind of, things were reopening. I thought, oh, well, now we will chat about transforming and coming out of quarantine and re-emerging into society. And now we find ourselves it's still in the midst of a pandemic, and also grappling with terrible injustice and the responses to that injustice within our society. And I thought, oh, wow. So the idea of what we will chat about today has shifted and changed. And I thought, it might be neat to start there and then see where it goes. So I guess, what is the last 3 months, including the last week, brought up for you as a thinker, as a philosopher of social construction?
Yeah, I think you're starting at just the right place, and that's the speed at which this has changed. It's just enormous. And when we got into the pandemic originally, it seemed as if everyone wanted to talk about how do we understand that, where will this take us, and so on. But by a week into it, it has shifted. It is now something else, a new set of concerns. And then I began to wonder, one of the crucial things about the pandemic was, how do we work together? We sensed that somehow we were all in it together, and it was crucial to take that into account. And this was one of those times when we really maybe had an opening to see that indeed in the world in general, we really must work together, not just in our communities, in our country, and so on. It is a world issue. And maybe this was the time we'd have that realization. That was my hope. That was really, I think, when we talked, that would have been my hope. But then as things have changed, I realized, this is just a wake-up call in a sense. This pandemic, this is going to become something like normal life, in the sense that it's going to be one thing after another, layered upon another, layered upon another. Now it's not only that we've got the pandemic, and not only that we've got our cities burning here, But we've also got the environmental issues, which we had before then. And these concatenate into economic issues, and now there are hurricanes and so on, which are going to make this all the more difficult. And the world, because we can communicate so rapidly, and what happens in one part of the world so rapidly affects another. The need for us to work together somehow is absolutely imperative. That if we divide into countries, into communities, into political parties, and we fight it out as to whose problem this is and who's responsible and who's at fault, and we turn it into politics, and everything is like that. There actually have been moments in the last week or so in which I thought, I'm not sure we can get it together as a human species. That is, it may be beyond us. The very way we understand the world in terms of separations and our inabilities to go past those between me and you and our country and your country and our people and our religion and your, and so on and so on. It has given me great pause, and it's not been a fun period to think cataclysmically about what this would portend for the future. So some of the things on my mind. Now I can go back to say something about relationships as well, but see where would you like to go with this now?
Well, what you brought up for me when you were speaking was there was, this on social media, there was this kind of a phrase going around, everyone is so quick to say, once we get back to normal, once we get back to normal. Yeah. But by God, the normal we had before wasn't that fantastic.
Well, that's another issue. I mean, part of the problem, the normal we had for a lot of people was fantastic, but it was working against the interest of a lot of other people. And the structure was powerful enough that you could contain it. And it's that way in many countries of the world. Again, it's whether you look at it as economic or political, is a way of certain people gathering together and creating things, structures which help them, and the others don't matter. Right. Again, this division that we have into groups, into parties, into commerce, into where every group is out for itself in some way, or is either silenced or has control. It's that whole structure of the way we are together, which disturbs me. Now, I want to say that this book on the relational being, that one that you looked at, I'm rather fond of that book because, I mean, part of the message of that book is that the very idea of being separated is already a construction. Everything that we've made sensible has been made sensible together. One cannot make sense alone, cut away from others. So that process of making sense of the world is done together. That's the fundamental glue that makes everything happen, that makes anything, creates value, that creates anything being worthwhile. So where we've come to prize the separate companies or separate countries, the second political party is separate me as opposed to you in terms of school, and every student is separate and so on. That very way of thinking, which has somehow got to be changed, the emphasis got to reshift. So it's the value of the process of the process of what it is, how we move together, that has got to be worked on, cherished, cared for, nurtured, and so on. And that's really a fundamental shift in our way of thinking about the world.
So you're bringing up for me questions of ontology.
Yeah.
And so we are these relational beings, and I know you didn't specify that it was an ontological, way, but it almost seemed like it almost was like that's just how we do. That's how we human is together. But what's not readily realized is that we are doing that. And so it's almost like what I'm hearing from you is that you need to raise an awareness of that contingent process in order to overcome injustices, in order to build systems that benefit everyone. I'm wondering, just as relational being together is a part of of who we are as humans. A little provocative question for you. Might division be as well? Perceiving division?
Might the division be what who we are?
Part of humanity. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the argument for me is that, and to go back to something you said, we are in relational process all the time. You can't step out of that as part of the argument. But the way in which we do that process is important. So that right now, you and I are coordinating, and we're doing pretty well at it. I mean, so far we haven't come to blows, and I haven't gotten off here. So, because we know how to do that in this context. We also know how to be pretty awful people. I suspect we've got that in our repertoire. We grow up with those repertoires available to us. We know how it goes. We have seen, because we watch television and movies, for example, we've seen thousands of murders. We know how it goes. We know we can do hate talk if we were on a theater and had to perform it, we could do it. We know those moves. So we've all created those. Many of them have been created in some sense to protect ourselves. That is, for example, again, to go back to education, I am taught to generate a position and defend it. Because it's my position. And if you present a position and everyone finds it fallacious, you're embarrassed, you're humiliated because it's your position. So you're taught to defend it almost until absurdity. So, but that's something we have learned to do. I mean, why don't we have education which says, look, this is a position I'm going to try out. And how would it go? Help me with this. This is the way I'd like to see it go. Could I get there? Could we generate this together? Or here's my position, but also I have also positions which are conflict with this. And can I also present those? And so on and so on. We could learn otherwise. We could learn ways of relating which are not divisive. I've tried some places to contrast a kind of generative coordination, a way we're doing pretty well together, kind of creating something that neither of us had before we got here. It's been pretty generative. But we could fall into a degenerate thing where you say, I'm not sure, Dr. Gergen, that's really essential. And I could say, well, what you don't understand is X, Y, and Z. And pretty soon we could go down a kind of a slope into which we wouldn't want to talk with each other anymore. We know how to do that.
Sure.
So the question is, could we develop resources, conditions that would enable us to move in those generative directions?
It's reminding me of how so I'm in Houston, Texas, and that is that's where George Floyd is from, and his body is back here now. And right now, currently, like as we're speaking, there's a march. His family is marching with thousands of Houstonians, downtown, to honor him. And I think that I've been looking at, and this is not to criticize how other cities have handled it. This is not to place judgment, but I've just been looking and watching, and the way that Houston, knock on wood, I hope this continues, but the way it has been thus far is that Houston has been in that generative space. As you were speaking, it just reminded me of how the police chief for Houston has been in that generative space, and he's been listening to protesters, marching alongside them. And I've seen other cities doing that as well. And I feel like the cities that don't do it, the cities that get into that divisive space for whatever reason, tend to get more press. Tend to get
Yeah, absolutely. The press is indeed part of this because of drama.
Yeah, and because they have to pay their bills and they know people want to watch, we're drawn to that. And
It's like you take there are 10,000 people down the street, but you take a picture of the looters, all 20 of them, and that becomes your drama. Yeah.
and so I think, I think that that idea makes me wonder about the question I was asking earlier, like, is the division a part of who we are? I don't know. I don't know if maybe it's only like 2% of our essence, but we pay more attention to it because of the pain that it generates, or the drama maybe, but that 98% of our essence would be relational and generative if we could give it that space. I don't know. I just, or creating those sort of lines is not helpful, and maybe just working to create and generate those spaces together would be the best way to go about helping.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've tended to look at it, once you start playing with the essences and as if you could divide it out, you're kind of stuck with that. And there's a kind of a fatalism about that. Well, we just are aggressive, hostile people that just put up with that, and so then you start establishing ways of like prisons to put all the aggressive people in there. And but if we could recognize, look, nothing, and this is again, this is perspective I work on. It's not like I know. It's not. It's more like, hey, this is a way of looking at it. Perhaps it could do something for us. But the way I've felt about it, if we recognize that we together are creating these things, and we're creating the downs and the ups, and it's the process of what we're creating and how we're creating it that seems to me where we should go, because we don't look at it this way. We could look at it another way, and those police chiefs that are taking the knee, for example, with the demonstrators, that's really that's a major move. That is a creative move, and look what happens with that. There's creative moves to say, no, it's the we that count. It's the we together that count. And if I fight you, you're going to fight back. If I put you in jail for this, you're going to be angry for the rest of your life. You are going to distrust and then be alienated and be back out on that street. And if you're angry enough, you might even loot, because what do you care? So
it makes me think a little, and this might be getting into like crossing the realms of psychology, philosophy into theology. I don't know, but the problem of evil, right? Why does evil exist in the world, sort of thing. Some philosophers posit that, in order to generate the good, you have to have the evil as a contrast, right? And then other philosophers posit, no, not necessarily. Where do you fall on that? Do we, as we're creating good and we're working to create good, is evil necessary to have good?
well, again, good and evil is a kind of a binary construction that we've generated. It doesn't have to be there. It could be. It can be there at any moment. And in fact, we've been very good at multiplying the numbers of goods and evils. Again, it's part of drama. It's part of multiculturalism, so that everything can be both good and evil simultaneously. And there's nothing one can do that isn't evil from some other perspective, probably more than one.
Wow. Yeah.
So then the question becomes, well, how do we talk about these things, and how do we talk about multiple goods? How do we move with that? Because that is the world we live in. And again, it's a matter of how we process when we realize that your evil is my good and vice versa. How do we move with that?
Yeah, and how do we do that without falling into the relativism trap, right?
Yeah. Well, and that is somewhat of a problem, because the relativism so-called trap suggests that there is a fundamental good which everybody should subscribe to, and if you don't subscribe to that, then somehow you're wrong. And usually, if you want to subscribe to it, you've got a particular good in mind, which everyone wouldn't subscribe to. So, rather than looking at it as relative, look, we're pluralist. We've got a plural world, and just rise above that and say what is the truly good is again going to get us in a major problem. So just recognize the pluralities, and then try to see where we go with that. Is it possible that we could recognize that people who are on the other side of what we think is good have something in mind? They're not trying to do evil. That is, in fact, it's hard to imagine, well, I think I'll, get up and do some evil today because I believe in evil. I mean, no, you believe in doing things that are right to do. They may be evil from some other point of view, but if I want to steal, it's because it's good to have money, good to be able to eat. And so I wouldn't steal if I didn't want it, if it wasn't achieving something that people agreed upon was good. No, I just stole this because I stole it. I mean, they don't do that.
Yeah, it's like trying to find a way of trying to understand why someone is doing something because it makes sense for you for some reason.
Yeah. And it makes sense in a way that seems reasonable and right from that perspective. So if we understand that, and it's hard to understand, it is hard for me to understand it as well. Let's start from that position and see how far we could get.
Right.
And it's really hard. It's hard for me in the present political context. It is very difficult. But what a mess we have made of this.
Yeah. I tell my students often these ideas are so important. They're not just important for the therapy room.
Yeah.
They are going to save the world.
If we can gain the understanding. Yeah.
If.
That's exactly my feeling too.
What days are you what days, what times, what contexts are you more hopeful that if might be realized versus days where you are less hopeful?
What are they like, or when are they?
Yeah, what contexts let you hope that that if might occur?
That's difficult because they can be at different times in different places. I mean, I've been so unsettled, as I've mentioned, until I read one morning as a kind of a minority view that in Camden, which is a city, a very poor city, very segregated city across the river from Philadelphia, poverty stricken. I mean, it's really one of the poorest, most homeless ridden, low income cities we have. Indeed, their police had gotten together with the people, and they had totally peaceful ways of protesting. And I would think there it would have been the police work with the people, and it was like something. And then, yes, this is possible. This is possible. Um, then I hear about that. I get news from New Zealand, in which the head of the government there, this woman, after they had like a Columbine shooting, a mass shooting of students, they changed the firearms laws. I mean, they just did it to something that was reasonable, and so on. These kinds of things give me hope. So, and I fasten on them because I don't want to just live pessimistically either. And yeah.
You mentioned the current political climate, and I think that people would love to hear from you about how to engage in generative dialogue with folks who are not aligning
Yeah.
politically with you. What would be your hope for
Yeah,
folks?
this has been a big topic, particularly in the political climate the last few years, because it split families, neighbors, communities, and indeed, I have relatives who might have gone through periods I don't want to talk with them. I don't want to. I don't want to be with them, and I'm subject to this, because I righteously indignant and angry at what's happening and so on, and can't imagine how you could support what's going on. Can't imagine it. So I have to imagine it, that you have to imagine that there's something on that other side, and you can find it. So that becomes a matter of practice. How do you do it practically? And I'm not the only one to speak to this. There have been a number of people who've been trying to work on that. In fact, some people in the newspaper from time to time will comment, well, how do you get together for Thanksgiving or something? It certainly helps not to go there. That is, not to put that on the agenda for a long time. To recognize what you have in common, to recognize what you commonly care for. You're in the same family, or you care for the same kinds of things, and because what brings us the things that we agree on usually far, far, far outnumber the disagreements. Right. And the rhetoric of disagreement has gotten so extreme that to start there, it's just impossible. So start with the other. At least it begins to recognize we know each other, we care for each other. We have a history together. It also helps for me to talk about things that you do want to do together. That is, things that you would realize together. How can we make that happen? How could we get together and make that happen? Or to emphasize those things, that not only that your past and what you share, but what we could do, what we could make happen. For example, in families, wouldn't it be great to get together X and at this lake, not that anymore, but sometime when we can go to lakes together. So those two things really have helped a lot. Also to kind of keep the temperature down, and keep the tone from being critical. Or the phrase, I love the phrase, help me to understand. Beautiful phrase. Anyway, it goes a long way. It goes a long way.
Yeah, it's something where I think that you said there's far more that unites us than divides us. I think that's so true, and when you said that, it made me think of the very historically new introduction of social media into our realm of relationship, and the neck break speed at which social media, just within the last 2 years has really changed and transformed how we communicate those differences, and I think is highlighting those, what 10, I'm quantifying everything today, that 10% of things that we disagree on become the only thing we focus on. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I wonder in general, as far as us as relational beings, what you think about social media, and then also specifically in regards to the topic we're discussing today.
There are two issues that have struck me, and it's not only it's the news and the social media. The news got away with for a long time. We just report. It's our job to report on what's happening, just tell the truth about what's happening. The social media could get away. We're just trying to give people the right to speak, and that's going to cost them a little bit to watch some advertising, but it looks neutral. Sure, everybody wants the right to speak. Oh, great, we can all hear what every star and our friends all are eating, and so on, and we can get the news, and without the realization that those are not reflections of the world. They're not expressions of the world. They create the world. They are creating our future. And that people who are news reporters and people who create social media have got to take some kind of responsibility for what they're doing, for how these things function, and that these should become parts of national debate as to how they function. Right now, I would say that democracy in its present form is probably going to be dysfunctional. That is, as a way of trying to make decisions. Democracy is based on division. Everybody a right their own opinion, and then you develop political parties that reflect your opinion, to help you out, to give to you, to promise you. So you're automatically got divisions from the get-go. Democracy is based on that. And whereas that was a good idea in terms of what it represented before, which is kind of tyranny or no voice, at this point, given multiple voices and anybody can say anything, and we are dividing against each other all the time, I don't know how government can work. And so I think I'm very interested now. I mean, this is part of what I work on now. Issues of how could you have like a deliberative democracy? This is a movement now among certain subgroups, both in academics and outside. What would a deliberative democracy, what would a relational process democracy look like? Where it's not a matter of choosing sides, it's a matter of working through complex problems with no solution, with multiple perspectives in a viable way. We need whole new ways of working in what we'll call governance. I sometimes call it relational governance. And to enable this.
You just gave my heart like a breath of fresh air. That's beautiful. I hadn't heard of that dialogue happening, and you made me think. Do you think maybe they did government that way more when every single decision wasn't being blasted on social media and in the news? They were able to pretend to be enemies during election years, and then they were able to to get things done like in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when you just didn't have this exposure of, well, so and so voted against this gun bill, so and so vote,
you could argue that democracy only worked by virtue of keeping people's opinions hidden. Or when you only had, like 3 radio networks.
Right.
Yeah. And nobody could think outside those particular positions. But those days are gone.
And I don't want to go back to those, right? Like I love the plurality, and I love, it's great, but you wonderful point of how do we govern now that box has been opened.
Yeah.
I think, we look at, the drinking and driving laws and we think, oh, how horrifying. People used to be able to drink and drive. We look at, you know, um, uh, the way that people used to consume sugary drinks. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we used to drink, multiple sodas a day, right? It's shocking. I always tell people in 20 years, 30 years, we're going to look back and say, oh my God, can you believe they just let people use the internet like this? Like,
Yeah.
wow, that's shocking, right? Like, I don't want to say regulated, but I think there needs to be, just the neuroscience of it, how addicted we are to checking and looking. And
Well, those are, other issues as well. That's right.
it's fascinating.
But how to move in such a way, though, that we're not always just forbidding everything, so that we would recognize that we can't do that. That I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Not because it's forbidden, because it's not the right thing to do.
It's a tyranny, right?
Yeah, you know. So the more understanding. I mean, by the way, maybe it's getting a little off topic, but one of those positive moments for me was I I worked a little bit in the Netherlands, where they don't really have a major drug problem there like we do, and yet there are minor drugs everywhere. I mean, they don't have the kind of drug problem we have in the United States. I said, how is it that that's possible? You got these cafes where you can go in and have a joint, but you don't have people with needle parks and dying, huge spikes and deaths from so on, so on. He said the police work with petty criminals. So, and they work with them and say, look, if you'll help us to keep these drugs out of here, we're going to tolerate a certain amount of this. Work with us. And they've been able to, because the petty criminals don't want to see this happen either. They've been able to stop major drugs from coming into the country. So that was enlightening. Whether you agree with the policy or not, I thought that is very interesting. You begin to say, well, look, you've got to be a little bit loose around the edges. But if you're a little loose and you work together, you can tolerate some things up to a point, but you will prevent major issues from taking place, major problems from happening.
Yeah, I think it's it's sounding like kind of for me the conversation has been, you know, looking at how quickly information comes in and then changes us.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's been kind of thematic for me in this conversation. So I guess since you're a future creator and we're creating a future together just in this conversation, and as people view it, they will be doing that. What would be your I hate to say advice, but I'll just use the word advice to folks as they go forward together and they're creating futures with one another?
Yeah. That's one of those big questions that you'd like to ponder for a long time about how it is we go on. Let me just share one piece of that, I think, which has been difficult for me because I've tended, like most of us, grow up with the idea when things go wrong, you find solutions, and that there are reasonable solutions, and that we can make progress. And the more I am into this with this constant change and multiplex and movement, of getting into the notion of being part of the flow, not trying to solve things, that these are solutions, this is the way it must be, but somehow being able to move more flexibly through the process and trying to develop a sense of trust that if we move together, it will move in good directions. That there are no solutions, there is no one reason, there is no way, there is a kind of flexibility, of coordination and continuous coordination and hope and trust. We get through the day with some kind of sense that we can manage.
I think that's beautiful, and I think it brings up for me of increasing trust through flexibility. That doing that process then begets more trust, which then begets more flexibility.
You've added something to it now. I love that. That's really fine. Now that's generative. That's where you pick up an idea, you take it somewhere, and we learn from each other.